What's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my role is to follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I started putting these videos together for my mates back home, and the easiest way was to chuck it up on YouTube. So if you're interested in following the macro developments in China every week, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, I hope you're doing well. You know the drill. If you're interested in a specific chapter or a specific story, just hit the link in the description below. And as always, as a new YouTuber, particularly in the current state of affairs politically, internationally, producing content out of China with a VPN, the YouTube algorithm does not like me at all. And the best way to tell it that it's barking up the wrong tree is to smash that like button. It is a massive help. It tells the algorithm this is legitimate content. So without further ado, as always, let's jump into this week's China Update. Okay, first up guys, let's talk about the economy. So the State Council held another meeting on Tuesday. There wasn't much new. I leafed through the Chinese version, though it did stress the need to build quote-unquote new infrastructure, which the National Development and Reform Commission advocated last week, and we discussed that in the last episode. So hit up last episode if you want to hear what I said about the policy of investing in new infrastructure. Economists expect local governments across the country to issue as much as 4 trillion RMB or 565 billion US dollars in so-called special bonds this year, roughly twice as much as last year. These special bonds are special bonds that local governments produce in order to gain revenue to meet their expenditure. Still, that won't be enough. Without sufficient government spending and with a weak global outlook, all that is left is household demand. And so how is household demand looking? Well, a group of 3 analysts from the Shandong-based Zhongtai Securities wrote a report estimating the true unemployment rate after the drop in the first quarter. They concluded that the true rate is approximately 20%, unemployment at 20%, not the official rate of 6.2%. The report claimed that as many as 70 million people lost their jobs in the first quarter. The report was quickly removed, however, after it was published online, and an official statement was made the next day by the securities agency saying that the official number is likely more accurate. Okay, that's employment. What about consumer confidence? Well, we have more data looking at this area. China's Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, which has a lovely campus, which I visited last year, concluded a survey of almost 30,000 people in late February and early March. Now, according to their survey, almost half of the Chinese households that were surveyed plan to increase their savings and cut back on spending after the outbreak is contained, while 40% would maintain normal spending patterns and only 9% will buy more. After this report was another survey by the People's Bank of China that typically looks into urban Chinese spending and saving habits. They found that in the first quarter of 2020, almost 30% of China's urban citizens say their earnings dropped from last year. This is compared with 15% for the same time last year. Finally, on the economic front, we should talk about the province of Hubei, which was the epicenter of the breakout in China. We now have their quarterly numbers, and their economy officially shrank by 40% in the first quarter of this year. Okay guys, next up, let's look at the health situation on the ground in China. On Monday in Beijing, a group of medical and viral experts and medical researchers told reporters that it's unlikely COVID-19 will disappear the same way SARS did. The large numbers of asymptomatic carriers make it very difficult to contain transmission as they can spread the virus. Some researchers said that this virus could be more like the common flu. The country is not completely safe either. There is still the risk of asymptomatic carriers as well as imported cases. The southern boundary has been identified as a particular area of concern, and with the border with Mongolia and Russia, the situation is still quite intense. In fact, some parts of Dongbei or Manchuria or the northeast are under lockdown, with quarantine periods now longer than 1 month. Regarding testing, it seems that at this point China has taken the road of selective testing rather than mass testing, which has been adopted in most other developed nations. The Chinese Academy of Medical Scientists said on Tuesday that testing accuracy must be improved and is currently too inaccurate. And on Wednesday, a special meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee, headed by Xi Jinping, said while the country has seen results, it is still far too early to declare victory over the pandemic within China itself. On a more positive note, schools and universities continue to sporadically open across the country, including high schools opening in both Shanghai and Beijing. An important sign of confidence too for the party was finally deciding on a date for the Lianghui, the two sessions, which was originally postponed due to the outbreak in Wuhan. The date is now the 21st of May, some 10 weeks after the original planned date. Also, a public servant called Tan Jun from the Yangtze River town of Yichang filed a lawsuit at the Wuhan People's Court against the local government there for damages. Tan's lawsuit cites a January 11th notice issued by the Hubei Health Commission denying that people-to-people transmission existed, but a state supervisory commission report published on March 19 stated that human-to-human transmissions were known about as early as December, according to Tan's lawsuit. Okay, next up we're going to talk about two major diplomatic incidents that have occurred over the last week or so. First up is with the EU. So the European External Action Service, which acts as a type of EU foreign ministry, was accused of publishing a watered-down version of a report criticizing China's disinformation efforts regarding the coronavirus. Some European media outlets reported on leaked emails revealing that Beijing had warned that the report would harm EU-China relations. The EEAS press office has denied these accusations, as has the Chinese ministry. While it appears that there certainly was lobbying from the Chinese side, which is to be expected in diplomacy, to be honest, I'm having difficulty ascertaining whether the report actually was watered down in response to pressure from Beijing. And in fact, a EU diplomat announced on Thursday that China did complain about the report, but insisted Beijing had absolutely no influence on thinking inside the EU agency. So in this case, it's difficult to know exactly what happened, and reports are still developing. But over this week there was an even more public diplomatic row, which I think is easier to make conclusions about, this time between China and Australia. In response to a call from the federal government of Australia for an investigation into the origin of the coronavirus, the Chinese ambassador Chang Jingye gave an interview with the Australian Financial Review, which appeared on the front page of Monday's edition of the newspaper. In the interview, Ambassador Chang said that the Chinese public could avoid Australian products in universities. He said, quote, "Maybe the ordinary people will say, why should we drink Australian wine, eat Australian beef?" He also went on to say that tourists would have second thoughts in coming to Australia or not. He said, quote, "Parents of the students would also think whether this is the best place to send their kids." In response to this interview, the federal government said the next day that Ambassador Chang's comments were, quote, "threats of economic coercion," unquote. All week following that exchange, state-run media outlets in China produced a series of pieces highly critical of the Australian government and its comments towards the ambassador. In fact, on Monday, the Global Times, which is a state-run news organization in China, had a piece which adopted language showcasing how some in China may really feel about smaller countries, saying, quote, "Australia is a bit like chewing gum stuck on the sole of China's shoes. Sometimes you have to find a stone to rub it off," end quote. Now, this style of assertive diplomacy is risky. While it does play well domestically and is understandable when employed against a large competitor like the United States, when it is used against a smaller country, it can come across as bullying in the eyes of other small countries. And compared to China, most countries are smaller countries. This has a reputational cost generally, particularly at a time where China needs to be careful how it maintains its image and reputation globally. It also greatly undermines the idea of China's peaceful rise, a narrative and a reputation that was carefully cultivated under the previous two Chinese administrations. In terms of the bilateral relationship, there is also risk and potential damage there, both in the economic and in the cultural spheres. And we can look at examples of this with the likes of Sweden and South Korea. After a series of diplomatic rows between Sweden and China, the Scandinavian nation responded by discontinuing cultural exchanges, ending sister city relationships, and closing Confucius institutions in the country. After economic sanctions against South Korea for its decision to install the THAAD missile defense systems, which were backed by the United States, and which the Chinese side said undermined their national security, Chinese conglomerates, large multinational conglomerates based in South Korea, decided to pull out of China and to diversify their supply chains away from the country. This accelerated during the trade war, and now the South Koreans and South Korean companies are some of the least exposed to disruptions to supply chains coming out of China. Now, Australia enjoys a large trade surplus with the People's Republic of China, which acts as a major market for its commodities, its tourism, and its higher education exports, which does give China much more leverage in any sort of dispute. China is very important, in fact, more important economically to Australia than the other way around. However, based on statements that are coming out of the federal government, including the intelligence and defense community, it suggests that this particular exchange is increasingly being seen as a national security objective, or touching on national security interests. In this case, nations typically will choose national security over economic concerns. In fact, on Thursday, the Australian government announced that it would support the effort to include Taiwan in the World Health Organization. Okay, finally, let's talk about oil. So I've discussed in previous episodes China's national security and its foreign policy objectives and policies in relation to oil and in the Middle East. China is a large importer of oil, with most of its oil coming from the Middle East. So you would think that the massive reduction, the crash in international oil and commodity prices would be a good thing for China. Well, not necessarily. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because its oil industry is dominated by massive state-owned enterprise titans that have special objectives or political objectives to pursue national energy security objectives. In the face of a major global oil glut, China's big three, China Petrochemical Corp, Sinopec, China National Offshore Oil Corp, and China National Petroleum Corporation, need to reduce costs while still fulfilling their obligations as state-owned oil titans, particularly their duty to ensure domestic energy security. China's three oil giants had been set to pour money into oil and gas exploration, particularly in the western province of Xinjiang, in accordance with their 7-year plan, which was formulated 2 years ago to meet the government's targets to achieve energy security. However, this week, the big three announced that they would be cutting spending this year by up to $19 billion, with Sinopec cutting back 1/3 of its expected spending for 2020. The state-run oil companies have also had a massive hit to their bottom lines. PetroChina, for example, the flagship subsidiary of China National Petroleum Corporation, reported a loss of 16 billion RMB in Q1, down to over 250%, with Sinopec, a subsidiary of Sinopec Group, another major state oil company, also reported a 20 billion RMB loss for the first quarter. This was approximately 230% lower than Q1 of last year. Okay guys, that was our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to ask. I always enjoy it. If you enjoyed the episode, smash that like button. I will see you guys next week on China Update.